But the French were not colonists in the sense of the word that the English were. They weren't, here I sit, here I plant, and here I die. They could send expeditions out from Three Rivers, from Montreal, from Quebec, for the fur trade, and they wanted the furs, of course, for the felt, to go into hats and insulation and things like that. And they were taking beaver and otter and martens and so forth and so on, and whatever else was there. So they'd come out in the spring, they'd establish their bases at places like Green Bay, Baie des Points, at St. Ignatius, Saint-Esprit, which is up near the Apostle Islands, and they would occupy these during the summertime, and then when the winter set in, then they'd go back. This is as dangerous a place in North America as there was. I can't imagine anybody nowadays doing what they did, taking the risk they took for what they got out of it. Now, granted, a lot of people left the fur trade and got rich, but a lot more died. One year they got trapped and had to winter out here. And I remember the passage from Radisson describing this.
There did fall such a quantity of snow and frost, and with such a thick mist, that all the snow stuck to those trees that are there so rough. It caused darkness upon the earth. We felled over and over again in the snow, and if we were alone we should have difficulty enough to rise again. It grows worse and worse daily.
The traders had an economic mission and had to respect a certain value system that they were coming in contact with. They didn't have the sort of spiritual or religious mission, this manifest destiny motivation behind them. This was business. This was establishing trade systems within the Great Lakes, and they had a stake in being able to get along with the people who knew the territory better than they.
We're standing on the tower at the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center, and from this vantage point, in a 360-degree panorama, you can see the entire history of northern Wisconsin played out in the landscape here. The most important part is probably what goes on over here in Chequamegon Bay in the 17th century. We've got the coming of the French fur traders to this area, and this is the place where Radisson and Grossier first came, saw the Apostle Islands for the first time in recorded history. That's some of the earliest documentation we have that tells us what life was like in this region. At that time, in the mid-1660s, there were Ottawa and Huron living on the mainland here. Madeline Island, way off to the back over here, was the spiritual center of the Ojibwe world. There are descriptions of large summer villages numbering in the 2000s, with the whole west end of the island one large wigwam community of summer lodges. All of those first explorers were all guided by the Indian people. They just couldn't maneuver up here without those Indian guides, using Indian transportation, the birch bark canoe to get around, and using trails, portage trails, and waterways that had been used by native peoples for centuries before the Europeans ever got here. The voyageurs, French explorers, the Ojibwe before them, that had to paddle out in the big water, were glad to get to these safe havens, these little harbors of calm water, at the Montreal River, for example, where it feeds into Lake Superior. But the problem, as soon as they got a couple of 100 yards inland, is they encountered their first waterfall and had to make that first portage. So that rest was short-lived. This is the beginning of the Flambeau Trail, which connected Lake Superior and the Apostle Islands to the inland, down to Lac du Flambeau and other places in the central part of the state. And the Ojibwe and later the French explorers and the voyageurs would have to portage their canoes and gear around these large waterfalls. They'd have to carry them up very steep embankments to get around these cliffs. It was quite an ordeal. It might take a whole day just to get a few hundred yards with all of your gear. But once you got past the waterfalls, then you got to take advantage of those fantastic waterways in Wisconsin that tied all of the different parts of the state together. Native peoples used these waterways to move around throughout this region, and they used very sophisticated transportation devices like the birch bark canoe here. And when the French came, they adopted those systems.
The French were particularly adept at going into alien cultures and adopting those customs that could most benefit their interests. But for the Frenchman accustomed to the highly restrictive and regimented French society, the personal freedom and nurturing support in the North American tribal cultures were perhaps a little too easy to adopt.
The voyageurs, were licensed, so that the government had control over them. The Coureurs de Bois, the wood runners, were not licensed. And these were the people who were dropping out of the official structure. They were the ones who were establishing a foothold. And then there was also concern because they were turning native, which was sauvage. And in French, the word sauvage doesn't quite have the same ring as savage. It meant wild. It meant people who were not living in European civilization. So there were the civilized, those who lived in the city culture, and there were the sauvage, those who lived in the wild native culture. And there were reports that many of the Coureurs de Bois were turning sauvage, which is pretty natural since they were living here. They had to adapt.
The first explorers were not prepared for what they found here. They were dependent upon the Ojibwe for everything. For shelter, they had to adapt to their system of building lodges, their system of procuring food. All of this stuff the French had to adapt to. They simply would not have survived in this area without adapting to the Native American way of survival up here. And so an independent trader would come in here and they would make contact with an Indian family and they might marry into that family to build their trade network. Because it was the Indian people who were doing the trapping and bringing those furs down to those traders who could then bundle and package all those furs and take them back to Montreal and then return to Chequamegon Bay and the Apostle Islands every year with new trade goods and repeat the process year in and year out.
When we hear stories of contact, we have to sort of forget our fascination with the figure in the dark forest, the savage, and think about the human interaction going on here. Because of the kind of extended family relationship that was practiced among the people, if you didn't have a place to go, the clan system had a way of absorbing you into the community to take care of people and exchange information to simply survive in this new territory. The knowledge of how difficult the climate, the weather conditions, the travel could be, the portages and the proper routes to follow from place to place. So for knowledge, for the comfort of being a part of a community, and certainly after a while those emotional bonds, those social bonds became more and more important.
Emotional bonds and social bonds developed naturally, whether the government approved or not. But there were other bonds that were being actively cultivated in New France,